Everybody in that country knew the arithmetic. One man, one horse, 3 days of drought between him and the nearest town that knew his name. Give the horse away and the numbers only end one way, a body against a rock in country too empty to have a name. So when I tell you I handed my last horse to two girls I'd known for half a day, two Apache sisters I'd been raised my whole life to fear, you already know how the story's supposed to end. I knew it too. I climbed into that grave on purpose with my eyes open, because there are some sums a man refuses to let come out right. What I didn't know, what nobody could have told me, what I still can't fully explain to you sitting here all these years later with the fire low, is that the country runs on a law older than arithmetic. I found that out in the dark, 3 days later dying, when something breathed warm against my neck. Stay with me. I've waited a long time to tell somebody how it really went. There's a thing my grandfather used to say before he went quiet for good. He said a man finds out what he's made of not when he's standing on something solid, but when the ground gives out from under him and he has to decide, fast, whether to grab for the nearest hand or save himself first. I didn't understand it when I was a boy. I understood it the morning I'm about to tell you about, when I was 26 years old, poorer than the dirt I slept on, and down to one horse and a saddle worth more than the horse. My name doesn't matter much to what happened, but you should have something to call me, so call me Elias. I kept a small leather book in my coat back then, the kind the traveling salesmen used to tally what they'd sold and what they were still owed. I never sold a thing in my life. I wrote down the days instead. 1 line a day, sometimes 2. Rained again. Found 3 head in the wash, dead. Coffee's gone. I'm telling you about that book because the morning everything turned over, the first thing I did when it was finished was reach for it. And my hand shook so badly I couldn't make the pencil land, and I just sat there staring at the empty line like it owed me an explanation. But I'm running ahead of the herd. Let me put you down where I was first, so the rest of it means something. There's a habit I had in those days that I should mention, because it tells you the kind of man I was before, and you can't measure how far a man traveled if you don't know where he started from. I counted things. When I was frightened or low or lying awake with my debts crawling over me in the dark, I'd count whatever was to hand. Cattle, stars, the cracks in a bunkhouse ceiling. The dollars I didn't have, which is a poor thing to count, but I counted them anyway, over and over, like worrying a sore tooth with your tongue because you can't leave it alone. My mother used to say I came out of her counting, and that I'd go into the ground still counting, and she meant it kindly, but she wasn't wrong. A man who counts is a man trying to make the world add up, trying to find the sum that proves he's safe. And the trouble with that country in that year was that the world would not add up no matter how you worked the figures. An accounting man in an unaddable country is a man slowly going to pieces in a very quiet, very orderly way. I tell you this so you'll understand what it cost me later, to do a thing that didn't add up at all and to do it on purpose. Section. It was the tail end of a drought year, the kind that makes liars out of every river you ever trusted. I'd come down out of the high country with $40 to my name in the spring and a string of debts I'd signed for in good faith. By that autumn, the $40 was a memory and the debts had grown teeth. I'd lost 2 horses to a fever that swept the low pastures, sold a third to a man in Sweetwater for less than half what she was worth because I needed to eat, and what I had left was a buckskin gelding named Pardon. I called him that because I'd won him in a card game off a preacher's son who begged my pardon the whole time he was losing, and the name stuck the way a burr sticks. Pardon was the last thing of value I owned. He was getting on in years, but he had a deep chest and a way of standing into the wind that told you he'd outlast things younger and prettier than himself. I'd ridden him 300 miles looking for work that summer, and the work had thinned out to almost nothing, because every outfit between the Picos and the high mesas was cutting hands loose, not hearing. A man with 1 horse and no money is a man the world has mostly finished with. I knew that. I'd made my peace with it the way you make peace with weather, which is to say I hadn't, but I'd stopped arguing. The morning it happened, I was camped on a shelf of rock above a bend in a river that the maps called one thing, and the people who lived near it called another. It had been a real river once. Now it ran shallow and brown and mean, the way water gets when there isn't enough of it to be generous. I'd watered Pardon at dusk and hobbled him loose, and I'd slept badly the way you do when your belly's arguing with you, and I woke before light to the sound of something wrong. It wasn't a loud sound, that's the part I remember. People think disaster announces itself, comes in with thunder. Mostly it doesn't. Mostly it's a small wrong sound underneath the ordinary ones, and you lie there in the dark trying to decide if you imagined it. I heard the river which I'd been hearing all night, and under the river I heard a voice, not a shout. A voice pitched low and tight, the way a person talks when they're trying to stay calm for somebody else's sake, and the calm is the thinnest thing in the world. I got up. I want to be honest about this, because the whole rest of my life turned on what I did in the next few minutes, and I don't want to dress it up. My first thought when I heard that voice wasn't to help. My first thought was trouble, and trouble was the one thing I had plenty of already. I'd heard the stories every man in that country had heard, the ones the settlers told each other at night to make their fear feel like wisdom. Apache. The word alone was supposed to settle an argument. I'd never had a quarrel with the Apache in my life, never so much as traded a word, but I'd been taught to be afraid of them the way you're taught to be afraid of a stove before you've ever been burned. So my first thought was to stay still and let the dark keep me, and I am not proud of it, but there it is. Then the voice broke, just slightly. A small crack in it, the way a voice cracks when the calm finally loses, and under that fainter, a second voice, younger, crying in the particular way that children cry when they've been told to be brave and can't manage it anymore. I went down toward the river. I don't remember deciding to. My feet had decided before the rest of me caught up, which my grandfather would have said was the only honest way a decision ever gets made. Section. The light was the gray that comes before the pink, just enough to turn shapes into guesses. The river had cut a deep channel at the bend, and the bank had given way sometime in the night, a whole shelf of it sliding down into the water and taking a horse with it. I could see the horse first. A paint, down in the channel, one foreleg bent wrong under the weight of itself, thrashing in the shallows in that awful way a horse thrashes when the leg won't answer. And caught against the horse, pinned between its weight and the collapsed bank, were two people. Two girls. That's what I saw when the light came up another notch. Two girls, and the older one had her arm around the younger and her back braced against the bank, and she was holding both their heads above the brown water by main strength, and she had been doing it, I would learn, for the better part of an hour. The horse had panicked and bolted in the dark, lost its footing where the bank gave, and come down on top of them in the channel, and the older sister had gotten herself wedged in such a way that she could keep the little one's face clear of the water, but she couldn't get them free, and the horse's thrashing was filling the channel and threatening every minute to roll and finish what the fall had started. The older one saw me on the bank. I'll never forget her face in that light. She was maybe 17. Her eyes found me, and there was no relief in them, none, because she didn't know what I was yet, whether I was rescue or one more thing the night had sent to take from her. She didn't beg. That's the thing that undid me looking back. A weaker spirit would have begged, and I'd have understood it, and it would have moved me less. She just looked at me and held her sister, and waited to find out what I was, and got ready, I think, to keep holding on even if the answer was the worst one. I came down the bank half falling. The water hit me cold enough to stop my breath. I want to tell you I had a plan, but I didn't. I had a knife and 2 hands and a horse worth more than my life on the shelf above me, and I had the sudden total understanding that there was no version of the next 10 minutes where I came out of it the same man. The paint was the problem. The paint was dying and didn't know it, and a dying horse in shallow water is 400 pounds of blind terror with hooves on it. Every time it thrashed, it ground the older girl harder against the bank and pushed the little one's face toward the water. I got my shoulder against the horse's neck and shoved, and it was like shoving a falling building. I went under. came up spitting silt. The younger girl was screaming now, a high, thin sound, and the older one said something to her in their own tongue, low and fierce and steady. And I didn't need the words to know it meant hold on, hold on, hold on. I made the first decision there in the cold and the silt, though I didn't think of it as a decision at the time. I cut the paint loose from them. I got my knife and I cut the cinch and the latigo and anything that was binding the girls to the horse's tack. And then I did the harder thing, which was to drive the dying animal away from them, toward the deeper water where it would drown, but where it would stop crushing them while it did. I put my hands on a creature in its last terror, and I sent it off to die alone so that two strangers could live. It screamed once when the deeper water took it. I have heard that sound in my sleep more nights than I can count. I'd do it again. Both of those things are true, and I've stopped trying to make them fit together. Section. With the horse gone, the water in the channel went still enough to work in. The older sister still couldn't move. Her foot was caught under the slab of fallen bank, wedged the way a stone wedges, and the more she pulled, the more the wet earth above her shifted and threatened to come down on all three of us. I got the little one free first. She came loose all at once, and I half threw her up the bank, and she scrambled and got her hands in the grass and pulled herself the rest of the way. And then she turned around and looked down at her sister and would not go further, would not save herself. And I understood right then that whatever these two were made of, it was the same thing, and there was a lot of it. The older girl's foot took longer. I had to dig. I had to put my hands down into the cold black water and pull mud away from her ankle handful by handful while the bank groaned over us, and she kept her eyes on me the whole time, not on her foot, on me, watching to see if I'd quit. I didn't quit. Not because I'm brave. I want that understood. I didn't quit because by then I was too far in to quit, and quitting would have meant climbing out past that little girl's face, and I didn't have it in me to do that and go on living. Her foot came free with a sound the mud made like it was sorry to let go. I got an arm under her and we came up the bank together, slipping, clawing, and the little one grabbed her sister's coat and hauled with everything in her small body, and the three of us came over the lip of that bank and lay in the cold grass in the gray light, breathing like we'd invented breathing, none of us able to speak. The sun came up while we lay there, I remember that. The pink came into the gray, and then the gold came into the pink, and the brown mean river turned for about 4 minutes into a ribbon of light, the way the ugliest things will sometimes if the angle's right, and the older girl turned her head and looked at it and then looked at me, and she said something I didn't understand, and I shook my head to show I didn't, and she said it again slower, and I still didn't, and then she did a thing I wasn't ready for. She put her hand flat on the grass between us, palm down, fingers spread, and she pressed it against the earth, and she held my eyes while she did it. I didn't have the words for what she meant. I only knew it was a promise of some kind, and that it was the first time in 2 years anybody had promised me anything at all. Section. Their names were Nabaha and Doli. The older one was Nabaha, though I wouldn't learn how to say it for days, and the little one was Doli, which I was told much later means bluebird, and she was 8 years old and had nearly drowned twice before sunrise, and the first thing she did once she could stand was wring the water out of her sister's hair like that was the most important business in the world. They had been traveling at night, the two of them alone, which told me something was badly wrong before anyone explained anything, because girls that age did not travel that country alone at night unless the alternative was worse. I got them up to my camp on the shelf. I built the fire back up, which took everything I knew about fire because the wood was damp and my hands were shaking, and I put my one blanket around both of them and they sat under it together, small as 2 birds, and I gave them what food I had, which was almost nothing, a little hard bread and some dried meat I'd been rationing to make it last another week. I gave it all to them. I didn't think about it. A man will tell you that generosity is a thing he chooses, and sometimes it is, but the truest kind isn't chosen at all. It just comes up out of you before the calculating part of your mind can get its boots on. I watched that little girl eat the last of my food, and I felt something I hadn't felt in so long I'd half forgotten the shape of it. I felt useful. I felt like a man who was good for something in the world besides accumulating debt and watching things die. Nabaha watched me the whole time. She had a way of watching that wasn't suspicion exactly, though there was caution in it, the caution of somebody who'd learned the hard way what people were. But underneath the caution there was something taking my measure, and I had the strange sense, sitting there soaked to the bone with no food left and my last horse cropping grass behind me, that I was being weighed on a scale I couldn't see, and that the weighing mattered more than I could possibly understand yet. She tried to talk to me. We had no language in common, but she had a few words of Spanish and I had a few worse ones, and between those and our hands we built a kind of bridge plank by plank. I learned they were sisters. I learned there had been others with them and there weren't any more, and I learned not to ask about that, because when I came near it, her face closed like a door and the little one went still in a way no 8-year-old should know how to go still. I learned they were trying to reach their people, who were somewhere to the north and west, in the broken country up against the mountains, and that something had separated them from those people, and that the river had nearly finished the job. What I couldn't learn, what she couldn't make me understand no matter how she tried, was why she kept looking past me at Pardon, why her eyes kept going to my horse and then coming back to my face with a question in them I couldn't read. I thought maybe she wanted to know if I'd give them a ride. I'd have given them the ride. I'd have walked and let them both ride and counted myself lucky for the company. But it wasn't that. It was something further down, something she was trying to ask that I didn't have the ears for, and it would be a full day and a night before I understood it. And by then it would be too late to take it back. And I would be glad, gladder than I'd ever been about anything, that it was. I watched the two of them through that first day the way you watch whether you don't understand yet, looking for the pattern under it. There were small things that told me who they were before any words did. The way Nabaha gave Dolly the larger share of everything without seeming to, sliding the bigger piece of bread across so smooth the little one never noticed she'd been protected. The way she kept her own body always a little between her sister and the open country, between her sister and me, between her sister and the world, an old habit worn so deep it didn't look like effort anymore. And the way Dolly, who'd nearly drowned twice before sunrise, kept finding small jobs to do, gathering twigs for the fire I'd already built, smoothing the blanket, wringing her sister's hair, because a child who has been through something too large will reach for the small, ordinary tasks the way a drowning person reaches for a rope, and the tasks hold them up. I had no children. I'd had no one to protect in a long time, not since my mother went, and watching those two sisters mind each other across my little fire opened a door in me I'd nailed shut years before. There's a particular loneliness to being a man with no one to stand between and the open country. You stop noticing it the way you stop noticing a sound that never quits. And then two strangers wash up out of a river, and you watch one of them slide the bigger piece of bread across to the other, and the door you nailed shut comes off its hinges all at once, and you sit there in the wreckage of it not knowing your own face. Section. I should tell you about Pardon properly now, because he's about to become the heart of this thing, and you ought to know him before you watch what I did. He was 11 years old that autumn, which is no great age for a man, but is a fair stretch for a horse that's worked. He had a white blaze that went crooked, like somebody had started to paint it straight and lost their nerve halfway down. He didn't like men who smelled of whiskey, and he didn't like sudden hands, and he'd take a careful kind of revenge on a careless rider, nothing dangerous, just enough to teach. But he'd carried me through country that killed better horses, and on the worst night of that whole bad year, the night I lost the two horses to the fever and sat up till dawn certain I was watching my whole life rot in front of me, Pardon had come and put his big head down over my shoulder and breathed against my neck, and I'd held onto his jaw and cried like the boy I'd stopped being, and he'd stood for it. He'd stood absolutely still and let me, and a horse will not do that for a man it hasn't decided on. So when I tell you he was the last thing of value I owned, I'm underselling it. He was the last thing I loved that was still alive and still mine. Everything else the year had taken. He was what was left of me that the drought hadn't gotten to. That afternoon, Nabaha finally made me understand part of what she'd been trying to say. She took a stick and drew in the dirt by the fire. She drew the mountains to the north, jagged little marks. She drew a long way between us and the mountains, and along that long way she made other marks, small ones, and I understood after a while that the small marks were dangers. Men. She drew men between us and the mountains. She pointed at herself and her sister, and then at the dangers and shook her head slow, and I understood that the reason two girls had been crossing that country alone at night was that the daylight roads belonged to people they couldn't risk meeting. They were running from something, or someone, and the river had been the lesser of the two evils they were caught between. Then she pointed at Pardon, and she pointed north, and she put her hand flat on the dirt again, that same gesture from the riverbank, palm down, pressed to the earth, and she looked at me, and at last I understood the question she'd been trying to ask me since dawn. She was asking me for my horse. Not to ride, to keep. She was asking me to give her and her sister my last horse so that the two of them could ride hard and fast through the dangerous miles to the mountains, faster than they could ever go on foot, fast enough maybe to slip past the men in the daylight gaps, fast enough to live. She was asking me for the one thing I had left in the world that I loved, and she knew what she was asking. I could see that she knew. It was written all over the careful, watchful, weighing way she'd looked at me all day. She knew that for a man like me, alone and broke in that country, giving up his horse was close to giving up his life. A man on foot out there was a dead man on a slow schedule. She knew all that, and she asked anyway, because her sister was 8 and the mountains were far and the men were between. And a person will ask the impossible of a stranger when the only other choice is to watch a bluebird die. Section. I didn't answer that afternoon. I want to be honest about that too. I didn't say yes the way the heroes in stories say yes, quick and clean and good. I sat by that fire with my last horse behind me and two strangers' lives in front of me, and I felt myself tear straight down the middle. Because here is the arithmetic I actually did sitting there. If I gave them pardon, I would almost certainly die. Not maybe, almost certainly. I was 3 days' hard ride from the nearest town that knew my name, with no food, no money, and no horse in a drought country at the cold end of the year. A man on foot in that. The math wasn't complicated. The math was a grave. And against that grave I had to set two girls I'd known for half a day, who were not my blood, not my people, not my anything, who came from a world I'd been taught my whole life to fear, and who would, if I kept my horse and saved my own skin, very probably die somewhere in the dangerous miles between here and the mountains, slower than me but just as sure. I sat there and I did the math, and the math said save yourself. The math is always going to say save yourself. That's what the math is for. And I want you to understand that I am not a brave man, and I am not an especially good one. I'm a man who lost everything he had through bad luck and worse decisions, and was scraping the bottom of his own life with both hands. And the math made sense to me. It made all the sense in the world. Dolly fell asleep against her sister's side while I sat there doing the math. She just went out the way exhausted children do, between one breath and the next, her small face going slack and trusting, her hand still knotted in her sister's wet coat. And Nabaha sat there holding her, not pushing me, not begging, just letting me see them, letting me look at exactly what my arithmetic was weighing. And there is nothing in this world heavier to set against your own survival than a sleeping child who has no one but a girl barely older than herself. And that girl looking at you across a fire, asking you with her whole still body to be, just this once, more than your fear and your arithmetic. I thought about my grandfather while I sat there, the ground giving out from under a man, and the choice between the nearest hand and saving yourself. I'd carried his words around for 20 years like a stone in my pocket, smooth from handling, and I'd never once understood them. And now here was the ground gone out from under me, and here was the nearest hand. Two of them, small and cold and holding onto each other. And I finally understood that the old man hadn't been describing a thing that happens to a man. He'd been describing a thing a man chooses in the worst light with everything against it, and that the choosing is the whole of it. The choosing is what you're made of, and that all the years of solid ground are just the waiting room for the one moment the floor drops and you find out. I'd thought it was wisdom about courage. It wasn't. It was wisdom about love, which is the only kind of courage that costs you anything. I didn't answer. Night came on. I told her with my hands, sleep, decide tomorrow, and she nodded like she'd expected nothing else, like she knew that a real yes is a thing that has to be slept on or it isn't worth the breath it's said with. I lay awake the whole night. Pardon stood close, the way he did, and once he came and put his head down over me in the dark, and I held his crooked jaw in both hands, and I thought about all the country we'd crossed together, and the night he stood while I cried. And I knew, lying there in the cold with his breath on my neck, that I'd already decided, that I'd decided down at the river the second my feet carried me toward that voice before the rest of me could vote. I just hadn't let myself know it yet. Some decisions you make in an instant, and then spend a whole night working up the courage to admit you've made. Toward dawn the wind came up out of the north, off the mountains, carrying the cold down to us, and somewhere out in the dark I thought I heard horses. Not Pardon. Other horses far off, the way sound carries strange over open country at night there and then gone. I told myself I'd imagined it. I told myself a lot of things that night. I didn't write in my book. The line for that day stayed blank. I lay in the dark with my hand on my last horse's face, and I waited for the light, and I tried to find the words for what I was about to give away and why, and I couldn't, and the line stayed empty, and that empty line is the truest thing I ever wrote. I want to tell it plain without dressing, because the giving was the plainest thing I ever did, and dressing it up would be a kind of lie. The sun wasn't up yet, just the gray coming, the same gray I'd pulled them out of the river in the day before, like the world only had the one color to start its mornings with. I got up stiff and cold from a night I hadn't slept through, and I walked over to Pardon, and I stood with him a while. I put my forehead against the flat of his cheek the way I'd done 1,000 mornings, and he stood for it the way he always did, patient, breathing his big slow breaths, smelling of horse and damp and the dust that never fully washed out of him. And I said goodbye to him with my hands and my breath and not one word, because if I tried to say a word out loud, I'd have lost the whole thing right there. Then I saddled him. That was the part that nearly broke me, if you want the truth. Cinching my own saddle onto my own horse to give them both away. My hands knew the work so well they did it without me. Every buckle and strap a thing I'd done so many times it lived in my fingers and not my head, and I stood there outside my own hands watching them give my life away one familiar motion at a time. I tightened the cinch. I checked the latigo, the one I'd cut loose from the dyeing paint the morning before, knotted now but sound. I shortened the stirrups for Nabaha's shorter legs without being asked, because some part of me had decided this in the night and was just now letting the rest of me find out. That saddle was the last good thing my father gave me before the work, and the worry took him. He'd bought it second-hand off a vaquero down south the year I turned 15, and it was already old then, the leather dark and supple with somebody else's lifetime of use, and he'd handed it to me without ceremony the way he handed me everything, gruff, like he was passing along a chore. And it was only years later I understood that the saddle was the one fine thing he'd ever managed to give anybody, that he'd gone without to get it, that the gruffness was just the only language he had for love. I'd kept that saddle through everything, sold 3 horses out from under it and kept the saddle. It was worth more than Pardon, and it was worth more than that. It was the last of my father I could put my hands on, and I cinched it onto my horse and gave them both away together, the horse and the last of my father. And I want you to know I did the arithmetic on that too, sitting there in the night. what it would mean to let go of the one thing my father's hands had touched that I had left. And I let it go anyway, because a saddle is a saddle and a bluebird is a child. And there are some sums even a counting man won't dignify by working them twice. Nabaha understood what I was doing before I finished. She came and stood by Pardon's head and watched me work, and I felt her watching. And when I straightened up from the cinch, she looked at me with an expression I have spent the rest of my life trying to deserve. It wasn't gratitude exactly. Gratitude is too small and too clean a word. It was recognition. She had asked the impossible of a stranger, fully expecting the no that any sane man would have given her, and the stranger had said yes with his hands at first light, and she was looking at me like she was learning something about the world she hadn't been sure was true. I have been looked at with love since then, and with anger, and with every middling thing between, but I have never again been looked at like I was proof of something. A man could live a long bad life and be made whole by one look like that. I nearly was. Section. I gave her everything that went with the horse. My canteen, full from the river. The blanket. My knife after a moment's hesitation, because a man on foot in that country without a knife is worse than dead, but they were two girls riding into men, and the knife belonged with them more than it belonged with me. I kept my little leather book and the stub of pencil and the clothes I stood in, and I gave away the rest, and it was a strange light feeling, like the feeling after a fever breaks, when you're weak as water but the awful weight has lifted off your chest and you can breathe. I tried to tell her the way north. I drew it in the dirt the way she'd drawn the dangers for me, the river behind us, the long stretch of broken country, the gaps where she might slip past the daylight roads, the mountains. I marked a spring I knew of halfway, a green seep in a rock cleft that held water even in a drought year, and I made her say it back to me with her hands until I was sure she had it. I was giving away my horse, and I found I couldn't stop there. I had to give away everything I knew about staying alive in that country too. Pour it all into her like I was filling the canteen. Because once you've decided to save somebody, it turns out there's no bottom to it. You just keep giving until there's nothing left to give, and then you look for more. Dolly watched all of this with her enormous serious eyes. The bluebird. She'd slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a child who'd survived something too big to hold, and she'd woken up herself again, 8 years old and curious and grave, and she'd been watching me give her life back to her all morning without fully understanding the price of it. But children understand more than we credit. When I lifted her up onto Pardon's back behind her sister, she reached down and put her small cold hand against my cheek, the way her sister had pressed her hand to the earth, and she said one word in their tongue, soft. And I didn't know it then, but I learned it later, and I'll tell you what it meant when we get there, because I don't want to spend it too early. Section. Then they were mounted, the two of them on my last horse, in the gray light, and there was nothing left to do but the thing I'd been not thinking about all morning, which was to let them go and watch them get smaller and turn around and start walking the other way into the rest of my short life. Nabaha looked down at me from Pardon's back. She had my reins in her hands. She'd gathered them right, I noticed, easy and sure, a girl who'd been on horses since before she could walk, and Pardon had felt it and settled under her the way he settled under a rider he trusted. And some cracked, foolish part of me was glad even then that my horse would be carried off by hands that knew him. She looked down at me and she said something long in her own language, and I shook my head that I didn't understand, and she said it again, slower, holding my eyes, and I understood that she wasn't translating it for me. She was saying it for herself. She was making me a promise in the only words she had, knowing I couldn't follow them, trusting the promise to carry even though the meaning didn't. And then she did the hand on the earth again, leaned down from the saddle and pressed her palm flat to the ground between us, and she said a word I did catch, because she'd taught it to me by the fire. The word for return, or for come back. I was never sure which, and the difference has haunted me because they're not the same promise at all. I said the only thing I could think to say, which was the truth, which was go. I said it in English, and I waved my arm north, and I tried to make my face the face of a man who was fine, who had not just given away the last warm living thing he loved, who would be perfectly all right walking 3 days through a drought with no water and no food and no horse. I don't think my face managed it. But I said go, and I meant it, because the longer they stayed the worse the daylight got for them, and I hadn't given away my horse to have them dawdle on ceremony and die at noon. They went. Nabaha turned Pardon's head north and touched him with her heels, and he stepped out into the gray, my buckskin, my last horse, my Pardon, carrying 2 girls into the broken country, and I stood on that shelf above the mean brown river and watched the 3 of them get smaller. Dolly looked back. Once. She lifted her hand, that small hand that had been against my cheek, and held it up, not waving, just holding it up, showing it to me across the growing distance. And I held mine up the same way, and we stayed like that, the 2 of us, hands lifted, until the land took them down into a fold and they were gone. And then I was alone in that country with my life given away, and the sun came up over the river, and I turned south, and I started to walk. Section. I will not pretend the walking was anything but what it was. The first day I made decent time on the strength of having done a good thing. There is a kind of energy you run on after a sacrifice, a borrowed light, and it carries you further than it should, and then it sets you down hard. I walked south along the river while the river lasted, drinking when I needed to, and I told myself stories about reaching Sweetwater, about finding work, about the whole thing turning out fine. The good deed sat warm in my chest, and I walked on the warmth of it and made maybe 15 miles before dark, which on foot in that country is a real day's work. I caught myself counting my steps that first day. Old habit, the counting, surfacing the way old habits do when a man's mind needs something to hold. I counted to 1,000 and lost the place and started over, and somewhere in the 3rd or 4th thousand I noticed I'd stopped, that the counting had quietly fallen away, and I understood that something had shifted in me at that river that I hadn't taken the measure of yet. A man who counts is a man trying to make the world add up, and I'd just done the one thing in my whole life that didn't add up, that couldn't add up, that I'd done precisely because it didn't, and the counting had nothing left to do. The sum was already wrong. I'd made it wrong on purpose. And in the wreck of my arithmetic there was, of all things, a strange wide quiet, the quiet of a man who stopped trying to prove he's safe because he's finally done the unsafe thing and found he could still put one foot in front of the other afterward. I walked into the dark not counting, for the first time in years, and I slept that night the way Dolly had slept, all at once, dreamless, emptied out, and somehow clean. The second day the river bent away from my line and I had to leave it, and that's when the country started taking back what I'd given the girls. No water. I'd given away my canteen, and I want you to understand I never once regretted it, not for a second, but a man without water in a drought learns his own arithmetic fast. By midday my tongue had gone thick. By afternoon the heat was doing things to the air, making it shimmer and lie, putting water out at the edge of the world that wasn't there, and walking it backward every time I walked toward it. I knew the trick of it. Knowing the trick doesn't help. You walk toward the lie anyway because the alternative is to admit there's no water, and a man that thirsty can't afford to admit it. I found the spring I'd marked for Nabaha. That's a thing I should tell you, because it's the kind of small mercy the country hands you sometimes just to keep you honest. The green seep in the rock cleft halfway, the one I'd made her say back to me. I came on it the second evening half out of my mind, and I drank from it lying flat on my belly with my whole face in the cold, and I thought about the 2 girls maybe drinking from this same water a day ahead of me, and I laughed, actually laughed, a cracked, ugly sound out there alone, because the spring I'd given away to save them had circled back around and saved me too. The country has a sense of humor. It's not a kind one, but it's real. I slept by that spring and I dreamed, the only dream I remember from the whole walk, and it was a dream of my mother. She'd been dead 9 years by then. In the dream she was sitting at the table in the kitchen of the house I grew up in, the one the bank took the spring my father died, and she was counting something out on the table, coins or buttons, her hands moving the way they always did. And I came and stood in the doorway and watched her count, and I said, "Mama, I gave away my horse." And she didn't look up from her counting, and she said, "I know you did." And I said, "I think it's going to kill me." And she still didn't look up, and she said, "I know that too." And there was no grief in how she said it, just a kind of terrible tenderness, the tenderness of someone who can see the whole shape of a thing you can only see the start of. And then she stopped counting. That was the part that woke me. She stopped, and she set her hands flat on the table, palms down, fingers spread, exactly the way Nabaha had pressed her hands to the earth, and she finally looked up at me, and she opened her mouth to tell me something, and I woke before the words came, with the cold dawn on my face and the dream already going to pieces in my hands the way they do, and I lay there a long while trying to gather it back, trying to hear what she'd been about to say, and I never could, and I've never stopped wondering. The hands flat on the table, though. I kept that. I didn't understand yet why a dream would hand me that gesture the night before everything, but I kept it, and a day later, dying against a rock, I'd understand it better than I wanted to. Section. The third day was the bad one. I'm going to tell it short, because some things lose their truth when you spread them out, and this is one. I ran out of country I could read. I've been navigating by landmarks I half knew and a son I trusted too much, and somewhere on that third day I crossed from country I half knew into country I didn't know at all, and a man on foot alone, who doesn't know where he is and hasn't eaten in 3 days and has had 1 drink of water in 2, that man starts to come apart at the seams in a particular order. First, the body. The body had been complaining for days. Now it started lying down. My legs would just stop mid-stride, and I'd have to talk them back into it like talking to a balky animal. Then the mind. The heat and the hunger and the thirst got into my thinking and stirred it, and I started to lose the thread of what I was doing out there. I'd find myself stopped, staring at nothing with no memory of stopping. I talked to people who weren't there. I talked to my grandfather. I talked to Pardon, told him I was sorry, told him I'd had to, asked him to forgive me, and the country gave me back nothing, just heat and silence and the shimmer of water that wasn't there. Late on that third day, I sat down in the partial shade of a rock and I did not get back up, and I understood, in the clear cold way you understand things at the bottom, that this was the place. That a man's life ends somewhere and there's no reason it shouldn't end against a rock in country he can't name, and that mine was ending here and that it was all right. That was the strange part. It was all right. I wasn't afraid. I'd spent the whole bad year afraid of the debts, afraid of the empty country, afraid of being a man the world had finished with. And now at the actual end of it, the fear had gone somewhere and left me clean and quiet. And I thought about the 2 girls riding north on my horse. And I thought, with the last of my thinking, that if my dying was the price of their living, then it was the best bargain I ever made, the only good trade in a whole life of bad ones. And I closed my eyes against the rock, and I let go of the rope. I took out my little book first. That's a thing I should tell you, because it's the last thing I did with my own will before the dark took over, and a man's last willed act ought to be set down. I took out the little leather book and the stub of pencil with hands that barely answered me, and I turned to the blank line, the line for the morning I'd given Pardon away, the line I hadn't been able to fill, and I tried again to fill it. I sat against the rock dying, and I tried to find the words for what I'd done and why, the words that had escaped me for 3 days, and I want to tell you they came, that a dying man gets clarity, but they didn't. The line stayed blank. My hand made 1 mark, a single stroke, and then couldn't make the next, and I looked at that one lonely pencil stroke on the empty line, and I thought, that's it, that's the whole of what I've got to say, 1 mark and then nothing, and somehow that was all right too. Somehow the 1 mark felt truer than any sentence I could have managed, and I let the book fall closed in my lap, and I closed my eyes and I let go. I want to be careful here. I'm not going to tell you I saw anything. I didn't see a light or hear a voice or meet anybody who'd gone before. I'm not built for that, and I won't pretend. What happened in the dark behind my closed eyes was just the ordinary letting go of a tired animal, the body deciding it was finished, the mind following it down. There was no glory in it. There almost never is. We tell ourselves there will be and there isn't. There's just a man against a rock, getting smaller inside himself. The way I'd watched the girls get smaller against the land, until the land takes you down into a fold and you're gone. Section. I woke because something was breathing on my neck. I came up out of the dark slow and confused, and the first thing before my eyes would open was the breath. Big and slow and warm against my neck, and a smell I knew better than my own name, hoarse and damp and the dust that never washes out. And I thought, this is the dream. This is the kindness the dying mind does itself at the end. It's giving me pardon. It's letting me die thinking he came back. And I almost didn't open my eyes, because I didn't want to lose the dream by looking at it. The way you don't want to move when something good has landed on you and might fly off. But the breath was insistent. And then there was a nudge, a hard, real nudge of a hard, real head against my shoulder, the kind of nudge that doesn't come from a dream, the kind that comes from a creature that has decided you have lain there long enough. And I opened my eyes. It was night. There were stars, a whole spilled wealth of them, the cold, deep stars you only get in that empty country. And standing over me, blotting out a patch of them, was a horse. Not Pardon. I knew that the same instant I hoped it, the way you know things at the bottom. This horse was dark where Pardon was buckskin, taller, younger, a mare. And she was looking down at me with her ears forward and her eyes catching the starlight. And she had no saddle and no bridle and no mark of any man on her at all. And she had come out of the empty night to stand over a dying stranger and breathe on his neck until he woke. I got my hand up. I don't know how. There shouldn't have been anything left in me to lift a hand with. But I got it up and I put it on her nose. And she let me. She stood for it. And her nose was warm and velvet and absolutely real. And I started to understand that I wasn't dreaming and I wasn't dead. And that something was happening that I had no name for and no way to explain. And that whatever it was, it had started with a hand pressed flat against the earth on a riverbank 3 days back. And a promise made in a language I couldn't follow. And then, past the mare, out in the dark, I heard the others. The soft, enormous sound of many horses standing in the night. The shift and stamp and blow of a herd, close, all around me. A sound I'd told myself I'd imagined on that first night and hadn't imagined at all. I lay there with my hand on the mare's nose and the stars wheeling slow overhead and a whole herd breathing in the dark around me. And I did the only thing a man can do when the world stops making the kind of sense he was raised on and starts making a deeper kind instead. I want to set down exactly what that sound was, because it's the hinge the whole rest of my life swings on, and it deserves to be got right. It wasn't a loud sound. I keep coming back to that. The morning at the river had started with a small, wrong sound under the ordinary ones, and now here at the far end of everything was its answer, a small right sound under the ordinary dark. The dark itself was full of breathing. 40 sets of lungs working slow and easy in the cold, the occasional soft stamp of a hoof shifting weight, the low blow of a horse clearing its nose, the creak of the cold ground understanding weight. It was the most peaceful sound I have ever heard, and it was happening around a man who'd lain down to die, and the wrongness of that, the impossible rightness of it, was what undid me. The country I knew did not make this sound around a dying stranger. The country I knew made the sound of wind and silence and your own heart going out. And here instead was this warm, crowded, breathing patience in the dark, this gathering, this watch being kept. And I understood, lying there, that I had been wrong about something fundamental, wrong my whole life, wrong about what the country was made of underneath, and that the wrongness was being corrected in the most patient way imaginable, by 40 horses standing around me in the dark refusing to let me die alone. I started to cry, not from sadness. I'd cried from sadness plenty that year, and this wasn't that. This came up from somewhere underneath sadness, underneath even relief, from the place where a man keeps the thing he can't afford to look at directly, which is the suspicion, never quite let in, that the world might after all be built on something other than the math that always says save yourself. I lay against that rock with a strange mare's breath on my face and a herd in the dark, and I wept like the whole bad year was coming out of me at once. And the mare stood for it, the way pardon used to, the way they will when they've decided on you. And the stars didn't care and the dark didn't care, but the horse cared. The horse had come, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. Section. I didn't understand it that night, and I won't pretend I fully understand it now. But I'm going to tell you the part I do understand, because I owe it to the telling. A man gives away his last horse to save two strangers, and it should be the end of him. By every law of arithmetic the country runs on. That's the bargain he makes, and he makes it with his eyes open. The math is a grave, and he climbs into it on purpose because there are two girls and a sleeping bluebird, and he has decided, against all sense, to be more than his fear. That's the story I thought I was in. The story of a good death, a sacrifice that costs everything and is its own and only reward. The kind of story that's true and hard and ends with a man against a rock in country he can't name. But that wasn't the story I was in. I found that out in the dark with a mare's breath on my neck. The story I was in had another turn in it, one I couldn't have seen from the riverbank, one that ran on a law older and stranger than arithmetic, and the herd standing around me in the starlight was the first word of it, and the rest of the words were coming with the dawn, and I lay there against the rock too weak to stand and too undone to be afraid, and I waited for the light, and for the first time in that whole long bad year, I wasn't waiting alone. Dawn came up over the herd, and I will spend whatever's left of my life trying to describe it to you and failing. But I'm going to try anyway, because a man owes the truth his best failure. There were 40 of them. I counted later when I could count, when the world had steadied enough to hold a number. 40 horses, standing in the gray-going gold light in a loose ring around the rock where I'd lain down to die, and not one of them wore the mark of a man. No saddle galls, no brand I could find, no halter-worn places behind the ears. They stood the way wild horses stand, alert and easy at the same time, a dozen of them grazing, a dozen more just standing with their heads up watching me, and the dark mare who'd woken me close by my side like she'd appointed herself to it. The light came up and turned their coats every color a horse comes in, bay and black and dun, and one old gray gone almost white, and a few paints whose markings caught the dawn like spilled things, and they steamed faintly in the cold, 40 plumes of breath rising in the gold light, and I sat up against my rock and looked at them and could not make my mind hold what my eyes were telling it. Because horses don't do this. I want that understood by anyone who didn't grow up around them. A wild herd does not gather around a downed man in the night and wait out the dark with him. A wild herd runs. Man is the smell they're built to flee, the shape that means trap and rope and the end of the running, and the deepest, oldest thing in a wild horse is the thing that takes it away from us fast every time. They do not come close. They do not breathe on our necks. They do not stand a vigil. And yet there they were, 40 of them in the gold light, having done every impossible thing on that list, and the only explanation I had was no explanation at all, just a hand pressed flat against the earth on a riverbank, and a girl's voice saying a word I couldn't follow. Section. I'm going to step outside the story for a moment, because I've carried this for a long time, and I've had a long time to think about what it was, and you deserve my best thinking even where my thinking runs out. I learned things later, pieces. It took years, and it took meeting the right people, and it took learning enough of the language to ask the right questions, and even then what I got was pieces, and I've never forced them into a shape neater than they came in. But here is what I came to believe, and you can do with it what you like. The people Nabaha and Doli were riding too. They're people in the broken country against the mountains, were horse people in a way I'd only ever heard rumored. Not horse people the way a cavalry man is a horse people, or a rancher, men who break and use and own. Something older and stranger and harder for a man like me to credit. A relationship between those particular people and the horses of that particular country that went back past anything written down, past memory into the place where memory turns into something else. There were stories. I won't repeat the ones I'm not sure of. But the thread that ran through all of them, the thread I came to trust, was that those people and those horses had an understanding, a thing passed both directions across the line that's supposed to divide us from the animals, and that a person who'd been raised inside that understanding could, in the worst extremity, call. Not command. Call. The way you'd call to family. And that the horses, sometimes, when it mattered enough, when the need was real and old and true, would answer. I think Nabaha called. Somewhere in the broken country, riding my pardon north with her sister, having made it through the dangerous miles, having reached or nearly reached her people, I think she called for the stranger she'd left behind to die. I think she pressed her hand to the earth the way she'd done 3 times in front of me, and she sent word down into whatever it is that connects those people to those horses, and the word went out across the country in a language with no sound, and the herd heard it. And the herd came. For me. A man not of their people, not of their understanding, who had nothing to recommend him to the old deep network of it except that he had given away his last horse to save 2 of their daughters, and that, it turned out, that was credential enough. That was the password. You save what they love and you become, for one dawn, something they will cross the empty country in the dark to save in return. That's what I came to believe. I've never been able to prove a word of it, and I've never much wanted to. Some things you hold without gripping. Section. The dark mare let me get up by leaning on her. That's a thing too. I couldn't stand on my own. 3 days without food and most of 2 without water had taken my legs out from under me, and when I tried to rise I went straight back down. And the mare, who owed me nothing, who I'd never touched before that night, stepped in clothes and stood like a wall, solid and patient, and let me get a fistful of her mane and haul myself up against her side, and she held still and held strong while I got my legs to remember their work. I leaned on a wild horse, and a wild horse let me, and the rest of the herd watched, and the sun came up the rest of the way, and I stood there swaying with my arm over a strange mare's back, alive, when by every law I knew I should have been 3 days into being carrion against a rock. There was water. The mare took me to it, or I followed the herd to it. I was never sure which way the leading went. A tank in the rock a 1/4 mile off. Rainwater from some storm that had missed me, holding cold and sweet in a stone basin. And I drank from it on my knees with horses drinking all around me, their long faces dipping and lifting, the drops running off their muzzles catching the light. And I have been to church a few times in my life, before and since. And I've never felt the thing they promised there as strong as I felt it on my knees at that stone tank drinking with the horses in the morning. Whatever the thing is, the thing church is pointing at. I felt it there with the horses, or I've never felt it at all. Section. They stayed with me 3 days. I don't have a tidy explanation for that either, and I've stopped looking for one. The herd that came in the night didn't scatter at dawn the way sense said it should. It stayed. It moved when I moved, slow, matching the broken pace of a half-dead man, and it grazed when I rested. And at night it drew in close around wherever I'd lain down, and it kept the cold and the dark and the loneliness off me with the sheer fact of its breathing presence. 40 hearts beating in the dark around one failing one. And slowly, over 3 days, the failing one stopped failing. The dark mare stayed closest. By the 2nd day she'd let me lean on her to walk, properly walk, my hand wound in her mane and my weight half on her, and we went south together that way, the man and the mare and the herd strung out around us, and I talked to her the way I'd talked to Pardon, low and steady and constant, and she flicked her ears back to listen the way they do, and I told her everything. I told her about the bad year and the dead horses and the debts with teeth. I told her about the riverbank and the dying paint I'd sent off to drown, the worst thing I'd done, and she listened to that too and didn't judge me, which is more than I could do for myself. I told her about Dolly's hand on my cheek, and the word the bluebird had said that I didn't know the meaning of. I told a wild horse the whole truth of my life because there was no one else to tell, and she'd come out of the night to save me, and that earns a creature your whole truth. There was a colt in that herd, a leggy dun thing maybe 4 months old, who took a particular interest in me, the way the young ones will, all curiosity and no fear because they haven't lived long enough to learn the fear yet. He'd come and stand too close and study me with his soft, ridiculous face, and then spook himself at nothing and bolt off stiff-legged and come right back, over and over, the whole second day, and I found myself laughing at him, weak as I was, the first real laughing I'd done in longer than I could remember that wasn't the cracked, ugly kind. There's a medicine in a young animal's foolishness. It doesn't know the world is hard. It hasn't been told. And watching that dun colt spook at his own shadow and come back grinning, if a horse can grin, did something for me that no amount of solemn gratitude could have. It reminded me that the country that had nearly killed me was the same country that grew this idiot colt, that the hardness and the foolish soft new life were the same thing wearing two faces, and that a man gets to choose, every morning, which face he's going to believe in. I decided, somewhere on that second day, watching the colt, that I was going to believe in the colt. I've mostly kept to it. By the third night I could feel myself coming back into my body, the way you feel a limb you've slept on come back, all pins and pain, and then, slowly, yours again. The herd seemed to know it before I did. They drew in a little less close that last night, gave me a little more room, the way you ease off someone who's mending, and I understood without being told that they were getting ready to give me back. There's a grace in knowing when to stop carrying a thing. I've met few people who had it. That herd had it. They'd carried me exactly as far as I needed, and not one step into making me less able to carry myself. And that, I've come to think, is the rarest kind of love there is, the kind that's always working toward your not needing it. On the third day, near evening, we came up over a rise and I saw smoke. Far off, south and a little east, the thin straight smoke of a chimney, which meant a homestead, which meant people, which meant I was going to live in the ordinary way now, among my own kind, in a house with walls. I stopped on the rise and looked at the smoke and felt the strangest grief, because I knew what it meant. It meant the herd was about to leave me. You don't bring 40 wild horses up to a homesteader's door. The understanding I'd been let into for 3 days had an edge to it, and the edge was that smoke. And I stood on the rise with my hand in the dark mare's mane, and I understood that the impossible thing was ending, the way impossible things do, by handing you gently back to the possible. Section. The leaving was quiet. I'd braced for something, and there wasn't anything to brace for. I stood on the rise a long while, putting it off, and the mare stood with me, and then I made myself do the thing. I made myself take my hand out of her mane and step back, and I put both my hands flat against the sides of her face the way I'd held Pardon's jaw the night he stood while I cried, and I looked into her dark eye and I said thank you, out loud, in English. The only word I had that was anywhere near big enough, and it wasn't near big enough, but I said it, thank you. And she breathed her big slow breath against me one more time. And then she turned, easy, no drama in it, and she walked back to the herd, and the herd folded her in. And they stood a moment all together looking at me on the rise, 40 of them in the long evening light. And then some signal I couldn't see passed through them, and they turned as one thing, the way a flock of birds turns. And they went north. I watched them get smaller, the way I'd watched the girls get smaller. The land has a way of taking the things you love down into its folds, and I stood on the rise and watched the herd flow back into the broken country, north, toward the mountains, toward wherever the dark mare had come from and wherever Nabaha had called from, and the dust of them hung gold in the last light and then settled, and the country was empty again, and I was alone again. But I was alive, and I was not the same man who'd lain down against the rock, and I was never going to be that man again. I walked down to the smoke. A widow named Halloran took me in, fed me, asked no questions I couldn't answer, and put me to work mending fence for wages once I could stand a full day, and that's a different story and a quieter one, and I'll keep it for myself. But I'll tell you this much of it. The first night in her dry barn in the clean straw with a full belly for the first time in a week, I took out my little leather book and the stub of pencil, and I turned to the blank line I'd left, the line for the morning I gave away my horse, the line my shaking hand couldn't fill. And I filled it. I'm not going to tell you what I wrote. It was 4 words. It's between me and the book and the dark mare and the bluebird. But I filled the line, finally. And then I wrote the next day's line and the next, and I went on, and the book got full, and the years went by. I should tell you that those years weren't easy, because I don't want you thinking the herd fixed everything. That a man walks out of a thing like that into clear country. It doesn't work that way. The debts were still there when I came back to myself. They don't forgive a man just because he's had a vision in the desert. I worked them off slow, a season at a time, mending the widow's fences and then her neighbor's fences, and then breaking colts for wages once my strength came all the way back. And there were winters I went hungry again, and nights the old fear came and sat on my chest the way it always had. The herd didn't take the hardness out of my life. What it took out was something else, harder to name. It took out the part of me that believed the hardness was all there was. Before the river, I'd been a man slowly agreeing with the world that he was finished, that the math was the math, and the math said no. After the rock, I couldn't agree with that anymore. I'd seen the math broken with my own eyes in the gold light 40 times over, and a man who's seen the math broken once will carry that against every grim winter for the rest of his life, like a coal he keeps alive under the ash. The years were hard, but I was never again a man who believed the hardness got the last word, and that, it turns out, is most of what a person needs to keep going. Not ease. Just the unkillable suspicion that ease isn't the only thing the world is made of. There was a stretch in there, the second winter, where I nearly wrote to no one and gave up the place and drifted, the way broke men drift. I'd had a run of bad luck. A colt I'd half broken went lame and a buyer backed out, and the widow's roof needed money I'd meant for my debts. And I sat in that barn one black night with my saddlebags half packed, and the old drifting feeling on me strong. And I took out the book and I read back through it, all the lines, all the way to the 4 words on the line I'd left blank so long, and I sat there in the lantern light reading my own life back to myself, and I closed the book and I unpacked the saddlebags and I stayed. The book did that, or the 4 words did. A man who has written down the truest thing that ever happened to him has a rope back to himself that he can climb when the drifting comes, and I climbed it that night, and I stayed. And because I stayed, I was there 4 years on when 2 riders came up over the rise. Section. I never saw the herd again. I want to be honest about that, because this is the kind of story that wants a reunion in it, and I won't give you one that didn't happen. I never saw those 40 horses again, or the dark mare, and most days I'm at peace with that, because some things are given to you once and the gift is in the onceness, and to ask for them twice is to misunderstand what they were. But I did see Nabaha again, and Dolly. That's the part I've been saving, and I've earned the right to tell it now, and so have you, for staying with me this far. It was 4 years on. I'd built something small for myself by then, on a piece of the widow Halloran's land that she'd let me work toward owning, and I'd put together a little string of horses again, honest stock, nothing grand, and I was a man with a roof and a name people knew, and a place in the ordinary world again. And one autumn evening near dark there were riders on the rise above my place, 2 of them, sitting their horses easy and still the way people sit a horse when they've been on one their whole lives, and I came out and shaded my eyes against the low sun and looked up at them, and one of them lifted her hand, just lifted it. Held it up, not waving, showing it to me across the distance, the way a bluebird had once done from the back of my buckskin horse, and I knew them before I could see their faces. I knew them in my chest before my eyes caught up. Dolly was 12, tall for it, grave-eyed still, but with a quickness in her now, a laugh waiting just under the gravity. And Nabaha was a grown woman, 21, and she sat her horse on the rise and looked down at the man and the roof and the little honest string of horses in the corral. And she saw that I'd lived, that the herd had done its work, that the bargain had come out the way no bargain in that country was supposed to come out with everybody living, and she smiled, and it was the recognition smile, the one that had made me whole on the riverbank. Only now there was 4 years of life behind it, and it was even harder to deserve. They came down. We had no more language in common than we'd ever had, but we had 4 years of having lived through the same impossible morning, and that turns out to be its own language, deeper than words, and we sat up most of that night by my fire, the three of us, and Dolly, who'd learned some English somewhere in the broken country, did the talking that needed talking. She told me they'd made it. That the herd had come for them too, in the dangerous miles, the night after they left me, that the horses had found them and ringed them and run them safe past the men in the daylight gaps, and that they'd reached their people, and that the people had been whole and waiting. She told me her sister had called the herd back south for me with her own hands, pressed flat to the earth, and that she'd never been sure it had worked, never known if the man who gave away his horse had lived or died against a rock, and that they'd come all this way, 4 years later, the first chance the world gave them to find out. And she told me about pardon. I'd been afraid to ask, the whole night, the way you're afraid to ask after someone when you've made your peace with the worst answer. But near dawn I made myself. I described him with my hands, the crooked blaze, the deep chest, and Dolly's grave face broke into the laugh that had been waiting under it all night. And she told me my buckskin was alive, was more than alive, was the most spoiled horse in the broken country, that he'd carried the two of them to safety, and then been retired to a life of standing in good grass being fed by children, that her people had understood at once what kind of horse he was, and what he'd been part of, and that he'd lived among them honored, a horse who'd given 2 daughters back to their people, until he died old and fat and easy 2 winters before, in his sleep, in the sun. She told me he was buried in a place that faced the mountains. And I sat by my fire and I put my face in my hands, and Nabaha put her hand on my shoulder, and I let myself grieve the horse I'd given away 4 years late, grieve him properly at last, now that I knew he'd been loved the whole way to the end. And there's a particular sweetness to grieving something when you finally know it was all right, when the grief has nothing of regret left in it, just love with no more work to do. Section. And then Dolly told me what the word meant, the one she'd said with her small cold hand against my cheek the morning I lifted her up onto Pardon's back. She'd carried it 4 years to give back to me, and she gave it to me by my fire with her sister watching, and I'm going to give it to you now, and then I'm going to stop, because there's nothing to say after it. She said the word didn't have a clean shape in English. She said it was the word you say to someone who has become family by what they did and not by blood. She said it meant something like the one we will not leave behind. She said that when she pressed her hand to my face that morning, 8 years old and just pulled from a river, she was telling me what I'd become to them in the space of a day, and that her sister had spent 4 years making it true, calling horses out of the dark to keep the promise a child made with her hand. The one we will not leave behind. Dolly is grown now, with children of her own who I'm told call me by a word in their tongue that I've made them teach me. And Nabaha lived a long life, and I went to the place where they took her when it ended, and I stood with her people, who were mine by then, by the law that runs deeper than arithmetic. And sometimes, on the cold nights in the empty country, I think I hear them out past the firelight, the soft, enormous sound of many horses standing in the dark. And I get up, old as I am, and I go out, and I press my hand flat against the earth. I've thought a great deal in the long quiet of getting old about why it worked, why the herd answered. I gave you my best guess earlier, and I stand by it, the old understanding, the call going out in a language with no sound. But there's a simpler way I've come to put it to myself, late at night, and I'll give it to you and let you keep whichever version sits easier. I think the world keeps a kind of account that has nothing to do with the account I spent my young years frantically counting. Not money, not safety, not the sums a frightened man works to prove he'll be all right. A different ledger. And I think the entry a man makes in that other ledger when he gives away the last thing he loves to save two strangers is an entry the world does not forget, and cannot forget, and will, when the man himself has reached the end of his own arithmetic and lain down to die, come and settle, not because he earned it the way you earn a wage, but because that other ledger always, always balances, in the end, in ways the first ledger never does. I went bankrupt in the only account I'd ever learned to keep, and I came up solvent in one I hadn't known was open, hadn't known I'd been paying into, all along, with every small, undramatic kindness of a hard and disappointing life. The herd was the world settling its other account. That's the simplest way I know to say it. A man spends his whole life afraid the math won't add up, and then one dawn finds out there was a second column all along, and that it was adding up the whole time, quietly in his favor, while he wasn't looking. I have never seen the herd again. But I have never once, since that morning, pressed my hand to the ground and felt nothing answer.